Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about a little bit of historical hurricane tracks here over South Florida and in the Eastern Gulf, and how things have changed recently, and maybe look at a little bit of why some research that I've been working on recently and starting to dig into, and I think you'll find it interesting. So obviously, here in South Florida, we're kind of known as a hurricane alley, and that's for sure. Historically, we've had a lot of hurricanes come here, both from the east and the west, but as we'll see in a minute, things have been a little bit different recently. Because if you look, this is from 1920 to 1950, and I've basically this is the coast.noaa.gov hurricanes, a great tool for plotting historical tracks. And I've plotted major hurricanes here because those are the ones that cause the most damage, and it's a little bit less messy to see, and it kind of gives you an idea of what's going on. And so from 1920 to 1950, we had all these hurricanes, like the Great Miami Hurricane of 1926. We had the 1928 Okeechobee Hurricane, which caused a lot of death, and a bunch of other hurricanes, major hurricanes that came in from the east, and a few in the Keys as well. We had the 1935 hurricane, which I think was even just outside of this range I plotted here. So it's a period with a lot of hurricane activity in southeast Florida from the east. And this is, there were people living here, obviously. Florida's population was starting to grow, but it was nothing like it is now. And then if you contrast that to the last 70 years, basically since 1951, over the last 70 plus years, there have really only been a couple of major hurricanes from the east. Andrew in 1992, which hit Homestead here, and then Betsy in 1965 hitting the Upper Keys. And really nothing in this area from downtown Miami up through West Palm Beach. And Andrew in 92 had a very small eye, so as destructive as it was mostly focused on South and Central Dade. So in terms of major hurricane impacts, the area from somewhere, basically downtown Miami and Key Biscayne up through West Palm hasn't seen anything from the east in many decades. And even Wilma in 2005 coming across here, it had a large wind field and a lot of strong winds with it as a Category 3, but it really didn't affect some of these things with major hurricane winds in a lot of places. So this is definitely something to think about as more and more people continue to move to the Sunshine State. And if we contrast that with Tallahassee and this Big Bend area, in the late 1800s, that's when they got most of their hurricanes. Really, most of this area had not seen a major hurricane since then. So you had three coming in from the west in the late 1800s, and then nothing in the historical record here in the Big Bend up until about 2017. But then if you look since 2018, now all of a sudden that has also changed. We had Michael in 2018 come in as a Category 5 in the area, and we also this area in the Big Bend also started to sort of get in on the action. Idalia in 2023 came in here to Hatchie as a Category 3. And it's not plotted on here, but Helene also from last year kind of came up the same direction. So now we've had, in the last 7 years or so, 3 major hurricanes now in this area. Tallahassee's been very fortunate that the eye walls of all 3 of these have just missed it. Michael just to the west, and then these 2, Helene and Dahlia, to the east. But this area started to really be a hurricane hotspot the last few years. And so it's kind of a curious thing, and it makes you wonder what's changed. And we'll look at that in a minute. And so if you look at what the National Hurricane Center has at Climatology, this is the total number of major hurricane strikes from 1900 to 2010. So this is old data. But you can see it basically has southeast Florida as a hot spot, and then this area, the Big Bend, has very little, and Taylor County actually had 0 when this map was plotted. But if you look at if you add then that data recently, since then we've had Michael over here, and then Helene and Idalia in Taylor County, whereas we haven't added anything in South Florida. So now it's really been kind of a atypical, or it's really sort of changed the historical climatology, and it's be interesting to see if this is something that's long term and a change that will continue, or if it's just a sort of a blip in the last couple decades. And that's something that I think deserves a lot more research. And part of that is that it really gives you an idea of how much risk and how often you can expect a hurricane here, because down here in South Florida, historically, this is one of the more frequent areas. But again, if you go back and look, a lot of those were sort of clustered in the 1920s and 1940s, and then we've had huge gaps afterwards. And now this area of the Big Bend, which had typically, on average, has to wait many decades for a hurricane or a major hurricane, has had several in the last few years. And so is the historical is this just, kind of a historical blip, or are some of these long-term patterns changing? And that's really important for us to dig into, because if, for example, if Southeast Florida gets another period where we have 3 or 4 major hurricanes within a couple of years, that's really going to put a lot of stress on insurance and infrastructure and things like that, with so many more millions of people down here. So one of the things that I've been digging into is looking at some of the historical storms that have hit Southeast Florida from the east, and looking at the pattern, the weather pattern, upper air pattern that's associated with this, and trying to figure out if that's part of why we haven't seen it much recently. So this is basically all those, if you go back to this, all these major hurricanes that hit Southeast Florida from the east. This is what the composite, or the average 500 millibar height. So that's basically like a mid-level steering, kind of a typical thing we look at in the atmosphere for large-scale atmospheric structure, large-scale steering. So this, obviously, these are your average hurricane here, approaching Southeast Florida. And the pattern that typically happens when you get a hurricane hitting Florida from the east, a major hurricane, so you have this big ridge centered up over New England, with the highest heights there kind of right over New England. And then you also have a trough, a dip in the jet stream over the Rockies. And so that forces the hurricane to the west, across Florida, and typically into the Gulf. And in contrast to that pattern that we have, if you look at the last basically 15 years or so, from 2010 to 2024, instead what we've had is the opposite. We've had an anomalous ridge over the Rockies and a trough here over the East Coast. So what that does is, if a hurricane's coming in from the east, instead of coming toward Florida, it tends to curve up here off the East Coast, maybe near Bermuda. We've seen that many times. Lee in 2023, we saw Earl in 2010, and we've had quite a few cases like that. But the flip side of this then is, if you have a storm down here in the Caribbean, like Michael in 2018, Helene last year, Idalia in 2023, with this dip in the jet stream, the hurricane tends to come up into it, and so that probably is why we've seen so much major hurricane activity in the Eastern Gulf, and even Ian, a similar one coming across Southwest Florida here. So this pattern, large-scale pattern that we see, has been very different than what we typically see when hurricanes hit Florida from the east, but it's also been favorable for the Eastern Gulf. And there is kind of a scientific name for this large-scale pattern. It's called the PNA, and basically there's two different phases, and the one that's typically associated with those East Coast hits is the negative phase, when you have high pressure over the east and then low heights or a trough out west. But what we've seen the last 15 years is much more common positive phase, with this trough, the dip in the east, and the ridge out west. And so there's a lot of questions as to whether this is caused by long-term changes in climate, or if we can expect this to maybe shift back over time. And I think answering those sort of questions, what's causing this change, and can we expect it to shift back over time, is going to be really important for helping to understand what Florida's hurricane risk might look like. Because if this is going to continue to be more common as a result of climate change, and as a result of different factors, in the Pacific and things like that, maybe we can expect, continued barrage of the Eastern Gulf, and cities like Tampa and Tallahassee will be hit. But if we, on the other hand, if things oscillate, as they often tend to do in the atmosphere, and flip back, maybe we'll get back to a pattern where this negative PNA happens, and we start getting Florida hits from the east again. And then South Florida, which has sort of built up over the last 20 years without much hurricane activity, will go back to being a hot spot and have to deal with the repercussions of that. So I want to keep digging into this. I think this is an area that's ripe for a lot of research, and I hope you find it interesting. And I think it kind of helps explain a little bit of what we're seeing, and there's a lot more we can look at. So thanks, everybody, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.